Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I am your simian host, Maria Legier, and this is Fear and Loathing in Secondary School, Part 1. My first inklings that life was a dismally unfair thing came in a blast during my years of secondary education. It was during those years, as the pre-pubescent freedom of childhood bliss flew away to be replaced by puberty, hormones, madness and perpetual crisis, as my boyish body first manifested clear signs of manhood, that the first properly understood symptoms from the infection of feminism showed its face in classrooms as clear and as brittle as glass. Of course, the signs were there that the girls were preferred and protected by teachers prior to this. Yet, in the prepubescent bliss of childhood, we are close to sexless, as no sexual characteristics are on display. At the very least not obviously so. The most obvious signs of sex and gender and the differences therein came from the mouths of us boys and girls who, in our childish innocence, believed the opposing side to have cooties. This made for some good moments and fond memories of chemical gender warfare, as both sides did their very best to spread their cooties into the other camp and so infect them, in order to create spies willing to divulge the strategic and tactical secrets of the other side so that the war could be won and ended once and for all, I suppose. Looking at it in hindsight, and with that peculiar gleam of nostalgia that tend to come post the 30th birthday, it is clear that this was nothing more than the onset of puberty, the moment where we understood something which we could not properly articulate at the time. That is, the other side is as intriguing and fascinating as it is terrifying and kinda icky. And if I could only understand where the fuck these strange and conflicting emotions stem from, I might be able to process the information properly. Besides, I never yet realized how beautiful her hair was, and what in the hell does all this mean? Those strange butterflies, that weird skipping of my heart, that strange and primal attraction. Better punch her in the shoulder and run away laughing. Boys will be boys. And so, fare thee well, innocence. Welcome confusion. Welcome inner turmoil. Welcome puberty. Welcome gender war tacticians in the shape of teachers speaking in twisted tongues, teaching all about the serpent cult of feminism. The oracle and the spectacle, the feminist ideology, the ism told in twos and threes and twisted tattletales. Not as yet mentioned by name, but lying there still, coiled at the feet of the altar in front of the dismally black hole blackboard where nimble spinning tongues and fingers spun nimbly spinning half-truths or full lies spat into our open mouths and minds that lapped it up as truth without a doubt. An altar upon which we were placed as a sacrifice to the ism, to remodel and restructure our biology and our sexuality as the horrid beasts of masculinity that we were then on the verge of becoming. And here I find myself caught in a crossroad, with many a road to follow. Figuring out which road to walk down is a difficult one. I could express the weird confusion felt from schools telling me that what I experienced within during puberty was a social construct, that what I knew to do in order to express my blossoming masculinity was not something innate to my nature, but something learned from this society wherein all things gender is a construct and we are all blank slates. I could explain the further confusion created as the teachers all insisted that the girls matured faster and better than the boys. Even if all things gender is a social construct, and so, really, there should be no differences in the level of maturation where the brains of boys and girls are concerned. Not to mention that, if all things are a social construct as we were told, then maturation is also a social construct, and not anything to take seriously. Or that this train of thought further whispered to me that the only thing these statements meant when taken to their logical conclusion is quite simple. Gender is a social construct. We are all blank slates. The girls mature faster than the boys, even when maturation is also a social construct. The schools have chosen the feminine as the norm, as the way to measure maturity and the proper way to teach and to learn, in other words. This difference of maturation, this apparently incredible evidence of the moral, intellectual and emotional superiority of the girls were mentioned as often as possible, beat into our adolescent minds to make sure that we understood and remembered this so-called fact. I could pick out single instances, single anecdotes of obvious preferential treatment of the girls, to the detriment of boys, and tell them in full. I have many of these anecdotes, many memories stored away of very clear discriminatory behavior from the schools and from the teachers that no one gave a fuck about, seeing as that it was the boys in entirety that was singled out for social execution and shame and not the girls. See, I am cursed with a very good long-term memory and a terrible short-term memory. Might have to turn this into a series of sorts. We'll see. Or I could try and explain how this dark cloud of shame that was forced down over the heads of the boys manifested in me personally. I could tell tales of how feminism wormed its way into the girls of my class and classroom fancy, turning quite a few of them into foot soldiers for the explosive feminist revolution, wielding such ridiculous arguments, hung up in the corridors of our schools come International Women's Day as handmade posters, funnily enough with loads of glitter and pink as I recall, that a female nurse earns less than a male doctor, and that this is a clear sign of gender discrimination. I am not making this shit up. Opposition to this nonsense, this clear political activism, was met with protest from teachers and students alike, making it very clear which opinion was okay to hold and which was not, even when the argument presented on the preposterous posters was not one of logic or of reason, even when the argument presented made no sense at all. Disobedience is not allowed. One must not go against the holy grain and coffee stain of feminism, lest one be shunned and publicly shamed for doing so by teachers wielding the magical doublespeak staff that says that all voices shall be heard, as long as it is the voices of the girls that scream feminism in your ears and immature minds that are heard. I remember one particular instance in a physical education class. One of our resident mean girls, and you all knew this girl growing up, I fucking guarantee it. The queen bitch, the bully and tin pot tyrant, Miss Queen Bee Supreme, who looked down her nose on everyone and treated everyone like shit if they were not within her immediate circle of friends, buzzing around her magnificent form and shape as she wreaked bloody havoc on everything and everyone. Yeah, you know the girl, you know the trope, you know the stereotype. The tropish stereotype is there for a reason, shining bright in every single high school comedy or drama we have ever seen, just as true and magnificent as are the jocks that surround her and beckon to her every wish and demand. It just so happens that one of her victims of perpetual bullying and mean girl ways and vices had finally had enough and struck back. Not in any physical way, gentlemen as we were indoctrinated into being. One should never hit a girl no matter what, you know. No, he had responded in kind to her snarling lips and ongoing for at least a year systematic bullying with a vicious insult. I cannot remember what she said that triggered his comeback, nor can I remember what he said. I was not present at the moment. No doubt it was trivial, as these things go, yet in the vice grip of confusing puberty, as we all know, nothing is ever trivial. In this PE class, our entire class was made to stand to attention and listen as Miss Queen Bee Supreme stood behind the teacher, crying. Obviously, the tin pot tyrant's first instinct at opposition was to run crying to our teacher, playing victim. And we all had to stand there and listen as our teacher confronted the one who had done nothing but reply in kind, berating him and telling us all how horrible he had acted, how there were limits, even in hell, as our teacher, who of course was a woman, put it. Darvoing is learned quickly, and it is encouraged brutally. Absolutely astonishing, I thought then, and I think now. If it was not made evident prior to this, it was bloody obvious after this that the girls were untouchable, no matter what they did. And I looked at the face of the one who had replied in kind as he was dumbstruck, completely aware that whatever he said, he would come out a loser and a scapegoat, and that she, the bully and the instigator, now stood free to do whatever the hell she wanted to do, and he could do nothing. Nor could he expect justice served from those who were supposed to serve justice at our school. The stacks were stacked against him, as they were stacked against all the boys for the single crime of being nothing but boys, for the crime of becoming men. As expected, this incident also let loose the ever-present shaming of the boys and their lack of maturity. For some reason, this was clear-cut evidence of the moral and emotional superiority of the girls, of their incredible maturity. Or the teachers just wanted an excuse to browbeat us boys a little more for our own personal bias and satisfaction. which I suspect to be the case, as you can always count on a dyed-in-the-wool feminist to use any opportunity to go on a petulant tirade about her most preferred topic, that is, the evil that men do. There were many instances of this nature. The ideology of feminism shone and shimmered and enveloped all of our school and all of our schooling within its web and in its cocoons. I remember being yelled at by a female pupil for having the gall, the audacity of being born at the 8th of March, which is International Women's Day, and about as much fun as one can imagine. That I, a foul male, would dare celebrate my birthday at this day of all women was an affront to the holy forces of fragile femininity. Just that I was born on that most fateful day was enough to pull her G-string over her head and deliver an atomic mental wedgie. Such a terrible act on my part, such a display of toxic masculinity this, to dare be born on that most hallowed day. Of course, she was nothing but a bitch and an insufferable cunt, caught just as much in the confusing mud of puberty as I was. But she was upheld and guided by the primal rage of feminism taught in school. And that is where the problem lies. I would not remember this as clearly now all these years later, were it not for that fact. This was learned behavior. Accepted behavior within the walls of our indoctrination chambers that told her and taught her that she could act like this, with impunity, as long as the victim of her fury and her frenzy was a boy, was becoming a man, was someone who was not a woman or becoming a woman. Yet, it was during sexual education that the searing misandry was made the most evident, or I should say, the most blatant. For beneath that roof and between the scarred and broken thighs of our indoctrination chamber, the ugliness and brute simplicity of male sexuality was made clear to us, as was the beauty and divine complexity of female sexuality. In a flash and a heat and what could quite possibly be referred to as a series of temper tantrums by our teacher, men and their lack of care and compassion during sex, as well as their lack of knowledge of the female body and sacred female orgasm, was brought us as communion wafers. Foul-smelling pieces of bullshit served on a silver platter that we were made to swallow whole and make part of our one and our all. Where male sexuality was concerned, it was so simplistic, apparently, as to be waved away in a token hand gesture. Pull here, prod there, ejaculate and finish. Men, you see, did not necessarily have any manner of emotional connection to the more or less willing victims of their simian sexuality. Quite the contrary. Ours was a philosophy of pump and dump. As opposed to women whose sexuality was driven by emotional connection and nothing more and nothing less. Sexual education was nothing but female sexual liberation and male sexual incarceration in front of the holy blackboard, behind a makeshift altar of prophylactics and Planned Parenthood. The birds and the bees and how pregnancy works and all that jazz was mentioned, of course, as though it had to be done quickly and be done with. The purely biological reasons for sexuality, for fornication, that is, the urge to procreate, and how all that stuff actually works was mentioned briefly and then forgotten in the rush to whip the boys with a nine-tailed cat of sexual shame for our simpering sexual simplicity. For you see, it was made out to be the fault of men, that is the patriarchy, that women and girls didn't masturbate as frequently as boys and men did, that women and girls didn't know their own bodies as well as they apparently should by that point in their lives. And I cannot help but think that maybe these poor and pitiful victims of a lack of masturbation would flick the bean with more regularity were they not told that their bodies and their sexuality was something sacred, something hallowed that was not to be given away or touched willy-nilly, but something to be savoured and treated as some peculiar sacrament. Were they not told that sex is given to men and done to women, but told the simple truth of the matter, that fucking is one of our most basic primal instincts and that sex is, at the same time, the most profound and the most simple pleasure of life? See, it sounds very traditional, does it not? That sex is something done to women by men and given to men by women. It is a very gender stereotypical view of things. Men cannot control themselves, and women must be protected from men. Would a chaperone be a good idea, perhaps and perchance? It is a tale as old as time, and here it was presented as something new, something profound, something liberating for women. It boggles the mind. But it is as these things are. Those who do not understand history are doomed to repeat it. It is the same old, packaged and presented as something new. Same shit, different day. I am no prude, and I have no issues with talking about sex and sexuality. Quite the contrary. I find it to be a very interesting topic of discussion. One of the reasons for this is that I find it so incredibly funny how much stock we put in it. How much of a protected and sheltered thing this very basic urge, need and drive is. For all manner of birth control has made it so that fucking is now a frivolous pursuit of pleasure more than it is a need and drive to procreate. And as an aside, I would very much like to state that this does not bother me. Not in the least. The thing is, as odd and weird as it is, turning it into pleasure first and pregnancy second has made it even more protected, even more holy. Despite all our ham-fisted talks about sexual liberation and sexual revolution and whatnots and what-alls, we seem to be more neurotic in regards to sex and sexuality now than we have been for quite some time. Almost as though one would be inclined to believe that a meaningless and pointless pursuit of immediate pleasure in one-night stands and topless Tinder dates with no strings attached and no responsibilities lined up poisoned the well some and made for some hell hath no fury scenarios, where a lover's scorn or a lover's regret the day after a frivolous session of in-the-moment fornication made for feelings that were not shared in kind and further shaming of male sexuality for doing just as his date did. Men are terribly irresponsible when having no strings attached sex. Women are not. They are liberated. And if both man and woman are drunk and have drunken sex, the man is a rapist and the woman is raped. And the world is such a weird and peculiar place that confusion does not even cover it. Forsooth, I do fear, sire, that we may have overcomplicated matters to the point of complete and utter absurdity. I do fear that we have lost the plot ages back, that we have descended into guttural chaos and base level desires that are never fulfilled even when we are told that this is what is needed to fulfill it. We are living in a Monty Python sketch, where one absurdity is explained with a higher level of absurdity. It is layers upon layers of absurdity, and I would be laughing my swinging dick and pendulous balls off were I not quietly weeping in the corner. But I am getting better. I swear. I only break into hysterical fits of crying and babbling 3 times a week these days. Anyhow, in those sexual education classes, the boys were shamed for the girls not masturbating and not knowing their own bodies. This despite none of us knowing their bodies either, and should we wish to know their bodies, we were beasts with only one thing on our minds. Not to mention that the same shame of not knowing a man's body was not laid in the palms and prickly nipples of the girls. Odd that. As though men are the ones who are supposed to run the show, from initiating dates to initiating sex. Or begging for it, more like. And still, wanting sex as a male was a horrible thing, and wanting sex as a woman was not a horrible thing, but a natural thing. Though the sex wanted by women was an emotional thing, and the sex wanted by men was a primal thing, a thing of domination and subjugation. It was a confusing message, sent and delivered. Sex was nothing to be ashamed of. Yet it was, at the very same time, something to be deeply ashamed of. We were told how incredibly complex female sexuality was, and that men would never properly understand it. Of course, the complexity of female sexuality was the complete opposite of male sexuality, simplistic enough to warrant barely a mention in front of the dismal blackboard. And were it mentioned, it was always with the barely concealed snarl of wild mockery and disgust. This, in turn, rendered every goddamned unwanted erection a source of shame, and unwanted erections in those days of puberty happened once every 10 minutes. You could set your bloody clock to it. There was nothing but spontaneous erections and a longing for some privacy and a few minutes to jerk off and be done with it. That is, if the erection came as a result of sexual desires, which it did not always do, nor does it always do so. This is something lacking in common knowledge, as I understand it. Considering the mangled menagerie of feminist thought and action, an erect penis is nothing but sexual, and shows nothing but sexual desire in the moment, even when it is not. Of course, a lack of erection necessarily must mean a lack of sexual interest and something the woman should be insulted by, and the man be ashamed of. Just as he should be ashamed of his erection, he should also be ashamed of his lack of erection. The penis is there for the woman, and that is that. Objectification ho. This is where sexual education is lacking, in their bro-beating of the male, for spontaneous erections were never mentioned or properly explained. Not as such. Erections meant nothing but the male being ready and willing to go, and that was that. It was a means to an end. For all the goddamned yammering and clamoring and claims that men don't know shit about women's bodies, Women sure as hell know next to nothing about men's bodies, evidenced in the absolute lack of knowledge as to how erections function, or how they do not function for that matter. For, you know, a man cannot be forced to penetrate. If he had an erection, he must have wanted it. This is the argument presented time and bloody time again to explain how a man cannot be raped by a woman. I had a girlfriend once who honestly believed I could get an erection at will, just as if I were flexing a muscle. She was flabbergasted that this was not the case. As much as I do believe that any sexual partner ought to know their way around their partner's body, this is not something that should only apply to men. Yet here we are, living in a culture where men are shamed for not knowing diddly squat about a female body by women that do not even know that an erection does not equal sexual desire on part of the man, nor that a lack of erection does not equal a lack of sexual desire. It is far more complex than what these cretins believe. And I lay a lot of the blame for this on the lackluster sexual education in schools whose main focus in my day was the deification of female sexuality and the vilification of male sexuality, whose main train of thought was to teach the boys that their natural sexual urges was something to be ashamed of and to teach the girls that theirs was not. And as much as I agree with the latter, it is something that should apply to both or none. There should be no shame in sexuality, be you a man or a woman. There should not be any shame attached to wanting to fuck. Yet there were and there was, as long as it was sent in the direction of the boys. Which is as evident now as fucking is natural, given the ongoing shaming of all things masculine from the girls and boys who grew up with this message imprinted in their developing minds and personalities, and now only parrot the points they never questioned or dared looked behind and beyond. To repeat the mantra and carry on with the shaming and the glorious cultural revolution of the feminist hive mind, the breaking down and dismantling of all things masculine. The cloud of shame hung over the heads of the boys for which they must repent all their lives, bend their necks and their heads, kiss her ring and make amends for being such lustful and primitive primates as we are. And this shaming, this perpetual demonizing and vilification of men and of masculinity, is presented as something that is supposed to help boys and to help men grow beyond the confines of traditional masculinity. Which is what exactly? Well, that depends on the feminist in question and the heat of the moment. But that don't matter at all, the moment one is able to understand that nature plays more of a part than nurture does in how men act and how men behave, in how women act and how women behave. This is not to say that nurture does not play a part, because of course it does. We cannot help but be a product of that which surrounds us as we grow up. We cannot help but be infused with the ideas and the lessons we learn. We are a product of our surroundings, to a certain extent. Yet, to claim that it is only nurture and not nature is to go against basic biology. It is to look at the state of nature, to look at the behavior of animals and state that humanity is above and beyond that. The problem of boys and men is not that they are boys and men. It's not that they have been told to be boys and to be men. The problem of boys and men is that they are not being told that it is okay for them to be boys and to be men. It is that we are living in a culture that has not a kind word stored away anywhere for boys, for men, or for masculinity. We are living in a culture in which we are told and taught that masculinity is something that must be done away with, that it is behavior that is toxic, that it is learned behavior that must be dismantled, and in its place the feminine shall thrive, in the guise of something gender neutral. For feminism has got us all shackled and in chains, have infested and infected our schools and our societies to such an extent that their philosophy is considered the norm and the guiding light. By their hands, and their hands alone, the masculine shall be dismantled, and the gender neutral take hold. Just a goddamned shame, then, that what they propose to be gender neutral is remarkably feminine, and that femininity is supposed to be some sort of saving grace for boys and for men who want nothing but to be free to be boys and to be men just as we fucking are. Thank you very much for watching. Here follows an outro most befitting a video of this nature, a blatant attempt at virtual panhandling. Should you wish to support this channel, as well as my blog and any further endeavours this strange path will take me on, there are a few ways you can do that. The easiest would be to like, share and subscribe, as well as clicking the sometimes functional notification bell. Having the message, such as it is, manspread and mansplained far and wide will do wonders. You could also support my rambling and barely contained insanity by buying my books, which are linked below. More books will be made available as time allows. I also have a Redbubble shop, linked below, where you can buy prints in various forms of some of the artwork presented in my videos. Or you can contact me through the contact form on my blog for original artwork, commissions or prints direct from the source, so to speak. Until next time, I am your humble bearded bard, Montreal, man spreading majestically beneath the steel sky of doom.